It's December 2001. You're standing in the heart of Buenos Aires, and the city feels like a circuit board melting. The air tastes like burnt rubber and panic. Tear gas drifts between buildings like fog. People slam hammers into the steel shutters of banks, not because it's dramatic, but because it's the only sound loud enough to match what's happening inside their heads. The Corralito has locked their savings in place. Not frozen like a bank holiday, frozen like a trap. A lifetime of work becomes a number on a screen you're no longer allowed to touch. Then the politics collapse, the way a bad economy always collapses, not with a clean ending, but with a fast, humiliating blur. 5 presidents in 2 weeks. A carousel of suits walking into the Casa Rosada and walking out again like replacement parts. Total economic anarchy. And then you do something absurdly simple. You get on a ferry. 50 kilometers. That's it. Across the thick brown water of the Rio de la Plata water, the color of coffee left out to long you step off the boat in Montevideo, and the first thing you notice isn't the skyline. It's the silence. People stroll the Rambla like they have time. They walk with thermos flasks tucked under their arms like a national uniform. They drink mate, slowly, as if the concept of a bank run is something that only happens in foreign movies. The banks are open. The ATMs spit out cash. The government is still. Boring. Predictably boring. You have crossed from one of the most unstable economies on Earth into a country that feels like it accidentally fell out of Europe and landed in South America. Welcome to Uruguay. For decades, economists, investors, political scientists, people who build careers on explaining chaos have stared at this tiny wedge of land squeezed between 2 giants and asked the same question. How? How does a country with no massive oil reserves, a population smaller than Connecticut, and a geography that puts it directly in the blast radius of South American instability manage to be the Switzerland of the South? Is it luck? Is it the weed? We'll get to the weed. Or is it something deeper, something cold, structural, and almost unfashionable in the modern age? A rigid devotion to contracts, to institutions, to the kind of rules that most countries only pretend to follow when it's convenient. Today, we're not doing travel brochure Uruguay. No sunsets, no beach shots, no hidden gem nonsense. We're tearing apart the machinery. We're going inside the algorithm that created the state. The banking instincts that saved it when the region collapsed. The energy model that quietly outperforms much of the G7. And the demographic clock ticking underneath the calm like a bomb you can't hear until it's too late. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The world is getting louder, more polarized, more violent, more unstable. And Uruguay is getting stronger. But stability is not free. Stability has a price tag. And in Uruguay, you pay it every single day. To understand why Uruguay functions like a sober accountant in a room full of drunken gamblers, you have to understand something almost offensive. Uruguay wasn't really supposed to exist. Most nations are born from a story people tell themselves for centuries: ethnicity, language, blood, destiny, revolution. Uruguay was born from something far less romantic. A spreadsheet, a diplomatic compromise, a solution engineered by an empire that cared less about flags and more about shipping lanes. Let's rewind to the 1820s. On one side, the Empire of Brazil. On the other, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata becomes Argentina. They are ripping each other apart in the Cisplatin War over a strip of land on the eastern bank of the river, the Banda Oriental. Nobody is winning. It's a stalemate, and stalemates are expensive. But more importantly, stalemates are bad for business. Enter the British Empire, the quiet puppet master of 19th century trade. Specifically, a man named John Ponsonby. Ponsonby doesn't care about Uruguayan nationalism. He doesn't care about the rolling hills or the cattle or the poetry of independence. Ponsonby cares about one thing: the port of Montevideo. Because whoever controls this region can choke the Rio de la Plata. And the British needed that river to remain an open artery international waters. If Argentina takes the land, they control the river. If Brazil takes the land, they control the river. So Ponsonby applies what we can call the buffer state algorithm. Neither of you gets it. We will create a new republic here in the middle. A geopolitical airbag. In 1828, the preliminary peace convention is signed, and Uruguay is born not as the triumph of a people, but as the neutral zone that keeps two giants from strangling each other and accidentally strangling global trade in the process. Now here's why that matters to your wallet in the modern era. When you are a small country created by treaty, you cannot survive by bullying your neighbors. You don't have the army. You don't have the population. You don't have the margin for error. Brazil has over 200 million people. Argentina, tens of millions. Uruguay has about 3.4 million. That is a rounding error in snow polo. So how do you survive? You survive by becoming addicted to rules. You become the teacher's pet of international law. You follow contracts so strictly that nobody has a clean excuse to crush you. You build institutions the way other countries build armies. That obsession born out of vulnerability becomes culture, and culture becomes policy. It's why Uruguay doesn't oscillate between messianic populism and military coups the way much of the region has. It's why when neighbors tear up contracts like paper napkins, Uruguay treats contracts like scripture. But the buffer state strategy has a shadow, because being a buffer also means being exposed. When Argentina catches a cold, Uruguay used to get pneumonia. And nowhere was that more visible than in the one place stability becomes real: the banks. For decades, Uruguay played a role that sounded glamorous on paper. It became the offshore safe deposit box for nervous Argentines. People who didn't trust their own government often correctly would drive across borders with physical dollars and deposit them in Montevideo. It worked, until it didn't. And when it didn't, Uruguay faced its greatest test. Because in 2002, right after Argentina imploded, the contagion hit Uruguay like a wave. Deposits fled. The peso collapsed. Unemployment surged. The system teetered. This was the moment Uruguay could have done what Argentina did: freeze accounts, rewrite contracts, steal stability through decree. Instead, Uruguay did something rare in a crisis. It refused to default. It chose pain. To preserve credibility, and the decision, quiet, legal boring, might be the single most important reason Uruguay is still stable today. Because countries don't become safe when times are good. They become safe when times are bad, and they still keep their word. And now we're at the edge of the next question. If Uruguay's first pillar is institutional DNA, where does the money come from to sustain it? Because rules alone don't pay pensions. Rules alone don't build healthcare. Rules alone don't keep a society calm when the world outside is burning. To understand Uruguay's real engine, why it doesn't explode like its neighbors, we have to go back to the early 1900s, to a man who treated welfare like national security, and who built a state so advanced for its time it almost looks like a historical glitch. Uruguay's stability isn't magic. It's not a personality trait. It's not national vibe. It's not the mate. It's not the beaches. It's a machine. And like every machine that works, it has a designer. To understand why Uruguay doesn't periodically burst into flames like its neighbors, we have to talk about a man who looked at the early 20th century on era of brutal, unregulated capitalism and said calmly, "No, we're not doing that." His name was José Batlle y Ordóñez, two-time president. Early 1900s. And the system he built, Battlismos, the mechanical engine under Uruguay's calm exterior. Not a slogan, not a philosophy. A structure, a blueprint. Let's set the scene. It's 1915. If you are a factory worker in New York, Chicago, London, Berlin, your life is a soot-stained grind. 12-hour shifts. Dangerous machinery. Child labor, still normal. If you get hurt, your retirement plan is poverty with a limp. Now look south, to Montevideo at the time, a city many Europeans couldn't locate on a map. Uruguay has just passed an 8-hour workday. And it doesn't stop there. Uruguay legalizes divorce, including allowing women to initiate it. A concept that felt like science fiction in a heavily Catholic world. It abolishes the death penalty. It separates church and state. It builds free, compulsory, secular education. This is not a Latin American stereotype. This is a country speedrunning modern social policy before World War I has even finished reshaping the planet. So the question becomes obvious. How did they pay for it? Because welfare isn't poetry. Welfare is accounting. Battle's genius wasn't just passing progressive laws. It was building a state that could fund itself without being wholly dependent on the boom and bust cycles of beef and wool exports. And his answer was both practical and controversial. He built a form of state capitalism not Soviet-style command economy, but a strategic monopoly model where the government takes control of essential, profitable sectors and uses their revenues to finance social stability. Uruguay didn't just regulate the economy, it owned the pipes. They built a major state bank to dominate finance. They created state insurance. They put the electricity system under a public company. They created ANCAP, giving the state a monopoly over oil refining, and for a long time, alcohol production too. Yes, for decades, the Uruguayan government effectively had a monopoly over your electricity, your gasoline, and your whiskey. The ultimate vertical integration of a citizen's weekend. Now, pause. Because if you lean even slightly toward free market economics, your skin is probably crawling. The steelman argument against state monopolies is strong. They get bloated. They get inefficient. It's become hiring machines for political allies. They suffocate private enterprise. They kill innovation. And eventually, the state starts printing money to cover the gaps. And you get the classic Latin American nightmare: inflation, corruption, collapse. So why didn't Uruguay end up like that? Why didn't Battlismo produce Argentine-style chaos? Because of the first pillar we already discussed, institutional survival instinct. Uruguay's entire existence depended on credibility. So it didn't fund its welfare state by firing up the money printer every time it ran out of cash. It funded it the boring, brutal way, through real revenues and relentless taxes. Uruguay doesn't hide the price tag, it wears it. If you walk into a supermarket in Montevideo today, you will likely pay more for basic goods, electronics, household items, gasoline than you would in many cities in the United States or Europe. The VAT sits around 22%. Income taxes and social contributions take a serious bite. There's a dark joke locals repeat like a lullaby. We pay Scandinavian taxes and sometimes get Latin American public services. It's funny because it hurts. But here's what those taxes are: buying not perfectly, not elegantly, but consistently. Social cohesion. In a continent where inequality acts like gasoline poured across politics, Uruguay is built like a firebreak. Latin America is historically one of the most unequal regions on Earth. High inequality breeds instability because it turns elections into survival battles. One side votes to protect wealth, the other votes to seize it. That's how populism rises. That's how coups happen. That's how contracts die. Uruguay engineered something different: a wide, durable middle class. And when you have a large middle class, politics becomes moderate almost by force. Because the median voter doesn't want revolution. They want their pension on time. They want healthcare that works. They want a life that feels predictable. That's the Battlismo effect. Elections stop feeling like life or death civil wars and start feeling like boring arguments about budgets. And boring is the point. But there's a catch hidden in this engine. Battlismo didn't just build stability. It built expectations. Once you create a thick safety net: pensions, healthcare, education, you don't get to tear it down without consequences. The state becomes not just a provider, but a promise. And in the 21st century, promises are expensive. Because stability today isn't threatened only by coups or inflation. It's threatened by something more primal: energy. The modern world is an energy machine. When energy prices spike, economies crack. When fuel supply breaks, politics breaks. When the lights go out, people stop believing in the system. And in the late 2000s, Uruguay faced an energy nightmare that should have humiliated it the way it humiliated so many other import-dependent countries. It had no oil. It had drought-killing hydropower. And it was trapped buying energy from neighbors who weren't exactly known for reliability. This is where Uruguay does something that reveals its true personality. Instead of improvising, it engineers. Instead of pretending, it builds. A scientist walks into the government, looks at the grid, and treats energy like national security. And in less than a decade, Uruguay pulls off something that makes major powers look slow, conflicted, and incompetent. In 2008, the world was melting. Wall Street was collapsing. Oil hit $147 a barrel. Entire economies discovered that leverage feels good on the way up and catastrophic on the way down. Uruguay had a problem that looked small on paper and terrifying in practice. It had zero oil reserves, was burning imported fossil fuels to keep the lights on. And to make matters worse, drought had crippled its hydroelectric dams, the one renewable source it relied on. The country was panic buying electricity from Argentina at inflated prices. Imagine the irony. The stable neighbor depending on the unstable one for power. It was an energy security nightmare. And here is where Uruguay does something very Uruguayan. It hires a physicist. His name was Ramon Mendez, not a career politician, not a populist, a scientist. He looked at Uruguay's energy balance sheet and concluded something simple. Renewable energy wasn't about saving the planet. It was about saving the country from volatility. This wasn't ideology. It was math. Uruguay imports oil in dollars. Oil prices spike globally. The local currency weakens. The government bleeds money. Inflation rises. Stability cracks. Energy independence for Uruguay wasn't green virtue. It was structural survival. So Mendez and the government made a decision that still looks radical today. They didn't nationalize the wind. They didn't print money. They didn't run up unsustainable debt. Instead, they used a tool we've already seen in this story: contracts. They offered long-term power purchase agreements, PPAs. The state told private investors, if you build wind farms or solar plants here, we guarantee we will buy your electricity for 20 years at a fixed price, denominated in US dollars, guaranteed. In a country with a reputation for honoring contracts, investors from Europe and the US saw something irresistible: stable returns, low political risk, and a functioning legal system in a volatile region. Capital flowed. In less than a decade, Uruguay transformed its electricity grid from fossil-dependent importer to generating roughly 98% of its electricity from renewable sources: wind, hydro, solar, biomass. 98%. For context, many advanced economies struggle to hit 30 or 40%. Drive across the Uruguayan countryside today, and you'll see something surreal. Cows grazing peacefully beneath massive wind turbines, blades turning steadily in Atlantic air. It looks almost poetic. But it's not poetry, it's strategy. When Russia invaded Ukraine and global gas prices exploded, Europe panicked. Inflation soared. Governments scrambled. Uruguay's electricity prices barely moved. Because the wind does not send invoices. The sun does not threaten sanctions. And when your energy system is insulated from global shocks, your politics become insulated too. That's the hidden superpower. But here's the nuance. Those 20-year PPAs weren't cheap. The guaranteed prices were generous to attract investors quickly. Renewable dominance gives stability, but it contributes to Uruguay's famously high cost of living. Again, Uruguay solves problems by making them expensive and predictable. Never chaotic. It's always paid for. And then comes the part everyone wants to talk about: the weed. In 2013, Uruguay became the first country in the world to fully legalize recreational cannabis nationwide. If you only read headlines, you'd think Uruguay turned into a reggae festival. But the reality is more administrative. It's because Uruguay didn't legalize cannabis to be cool. It legalized cannabis as a security strategy. Then President José Pepe Mujica, former guerrilla fighter who once lived in prison for over a decade, looked at Latin America's war on drugs and saw something simple. Illegality creates profit margins. Profit margins create cartels. Cartels create violence. So he did something radical. He nationalized the problem. Here's how it works. If you want cannabis in Uruguay, you have 3 options. Grow up to 6 plants at home after registering with the government. Join a cannabis club, PT99 plants, registered, or buy at a pharmacy. Yes, a pharmacy. But to buy, you scan your fingerprint into a biometric system. The government checks your identity and monthly quota 40 grams. The weed is produced by state-licensed companies. It's sold in generic packaging. The THC content is capped. The price is fixed low enough to compete with the black market, around $1.50 per gram. It's the least glamorous drug market on earth. And that's the point. The goal was not freedom. It was margin compression. If you remove the profit, you weaken the incentive for violence. Has it worked perfectly? No. The black market still exists. Some users want stronger strains. Supply occasionally runs short. But more than half of cannabis users now access it legally. That's millions in revenue that didn't go to organized crime. And while Uruguay's homicide rate has risen in recent years, something we'll confront. Directly later, it has not developed cartel-style territorial warfare like parts of Mexico, Brazil, or even Rosario in Argentina. Uruguay took a high-margin criminal market and turned it into a government form. Drug dealing became paperwork. That's a very Uruguayan solution. Solve chaos with bureaucracy. But here's where things get complicated. Energy is stable. Welfare is stable. Drug policy is stable. And yet, beneath all this calm, there's something no country can bureaucratize away. Time. Walk through affluent neighborhoods like Pasitos or Punta Carretas, and something feels different. It's not noise you notice. It's the absence of it. Few children, few strollers. A quiet that feels peaceful. Until you realize what it means. Uruguay is not exploding demographically like much of Latin America. It's shrinking. And when you build a generous welfare state on the assumption that young workers will support retirees, demographics stop being background data. They become destiny. Walk through Montevideo on a weekday afternoon. You'll notice something that doesn't show up in GDP charts. The cafes are calm, the parks are orderly. The elderly move slowly but confidently through neighborhoods that feel settled. And then it hits you. There aren't many children. Uruguay has a problem usually associated with Japan or Italy, not with Latin America. It is aging fast. To keep a population stable, a country needs a fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman. Uruguay's rate recently dropped to around 1.27. That's not gradual decline. That's a demographic cliff. Between 2015 and 2023, births fell dramatically. Entire classrooms vanished before they were even built. And here's why this matters economically. Remember Battlismo, the generous welfare state, the pensions, the public healthcare system? It functions like most social systems. Young workers fund current retirees. But when the number of retirees grows and the number of young workers shrinks, the math stops working. It's the silent Ponzi scheme of demographics. Unlike Argentina, Uruguay didn't wait for collapse. In 2023, President Luis Lacalle proposed raising the retirement age from 60 to 65. In many countries, that would ignite riots. In France, a 2-year increase set Paris on fire. In Uruguay, there were protests, debate, political friction. And then, Congress negotiated. The law passed, no collapse. No military intervention, no national breakdown. This is the difference. Uruguay treats existential problems like accounting problems, slowly, publicly, boringly. But even if pensions are stabilized, growth remains constrained. An aging country grows slower. That's the trade-off. Uruguay is choosing durability over dynamism. And yet, while demographic gravity pulls downward, another threat pushes from outside. Not coups, not hyperinflation. Logistics? Let's confront the paradox. Uruguay is stable. But it is not European safe. Its homicide rate hovers above many Western nations, higher than the United States in some years. How? Because stability and crime are not opposites. Geography matters. Remember the port of Montevideo, the Port Britain protected in the 19th century. Deep water, efficient logistics. Clean customs processes. That's excellent for exporting beef and soy. It's also excellent for exporting cocaine. As Brazil and Argentina cracked down on certain ports, traffickers shifted routes. The Hydra effect: squeeze one channel, another expands. Large cocaine shipments have been intercepted in Europe, traced back to Uruguay's containers. The violence that inflates the homicide rate is concentrated in specific neighborhoods, gang competition over domestic distribution and logistical corridors. But here's if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed a pattern. Uruguay solves problems the same way, over and over, by making them expensive. Want a stable energy grid? Guarantee high fixed prices for 20 years. Want a stable welfare state? Tax everything at Scandinavian levels. Want a stable currency? Keep monetary policy tight and let prices reflect real costs. It works, but it creates something economists in Uruguay call quietly, almost affectionately, the costo pays, the country cost. And it is very real. Let's take something simple: the Big Mac. In 2024, Uruguay regularly ranks as having one of the most expensive Big Macs in Latin America, comparable to parts of Europe. Why? Because nothing in Uruguay is cheap. Import a car. You're not just paying for the car. You're paying up to 115% internal tax depending on engine size, 22% VAT, customs brokerage fees, consular charges, administrative layers so dense you literally cannot bypass them. A Toyota Corolla that costs $22,000 in the United States can cost over $40,000 in Uruguay. Gasoline, among the most expensive in the Americas. Electronics, painful. Even domestic goods feel inflated compared to neighboring countries. Why would a country intentionally live like this? Because protectionism is a defensive strategy. Uruguay is small, 3.4 million people. There are no economies of scale. If it opened its market completely to cheap imports overnight, local industries would collapse instantly. Jobs would vanish. Unemployment would spike. Political calm would fracture. So Uruguay chooses the slow bleed of high prices over the sudden shock of open exposure. It builds a fortress. But fortresses are expensive to maintain, and expensive fortresses attract a certain kind of resident. Let's go to Punta del Este. Imagine Miami's coast, line but quieter, older, less chaotic. This is where South America's wealthy elites spend their summers. Argentine industrialists, Brazilian business magnates, European capital. They come for beaches, yes. But more importantly, they come for certainty. In a continent where inflation devours savings, Uruguay is a rare financial adult. You can transact in US dollars. You can buy property in US dollars. There are no capital controls trapping your money. The country maintains investment-grade credit ratings while many neighbors sit in junk territory. That credibility matters. During Argentina's recent inflation spiral, over 100%, even touching 200%, thousands of wealthy Argentines changed tax residency to Uruguay. President Lacalle, who made it easier, lowering the investment threshold for residency to roughly $380,000 in real estate. He didn't send tanks across the river. He sent tax incentives. To his economic warfare, legal, devastatingly effective. But here's the tension. The average Uruguayan earns roughly $800 to $1,000 a month. Try paying European-level prices on that income. Stability protects capital. It does not automatically create wealth. And that is Uruguay's central contradiction, a safe haven for dollars. In a country where locals feel squeezed by cost, the fortress works. But it narrows growth. For years, GDP expansion has hovered around 1 to 2%. This is the middle-income trap. Too expensive to compete with low-wage manufacturers. Not yet innovative enough to rival Switzerland or Singapore fully. Which means Uruguay needs a new engine. And it believes it has found one. Remember those wind turbines spinning quietly in the countryside? They do more than keep the lights on. Uruguay is now positioning itself to become a leader in green hydrogen. Here's the idea. Europe needs clean fuel to decarbonize heavy industry, aviation, shipping. Uruguay has excess renewable electricity, a stable legal framework, deep water ports, access to fresh water. Using renewable energy, you can split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen can be converted into synthetic fuels and exported. Memorandums of understanding have already been signed with German companies. Billions in potential investment. If successful, Uruguay transforms from agricultural exporter to green energy exporter, from cattle and soy to hydrogen and synthetic fuel. It could anchor itself strategically to Europe's energy transition. It could become the green Saudi Arabia of the South Atlantic. But here's the catch. Hydrogen requires water. A lot of water. And in 2023, Uruguay faced its worst drought in decades. Reservoirs dropped to historic lows. Tap water in Montevideo became salty. Citizens were told not to drink from the faucet. The contradiction is glaring. Can you promise to export water-derived hydrogen to Europe while struggling to supply fresh drinking water at home? Environmental groups are already protesting. They argue green hydrogen risks becoming green colonialism, exporting local resources for foreign consumption. The government counters that desalination, infrastructure upgrades, and careful regulation will prevent shortages. The bet is enormous. If they succeed, Uruguay gains a high-tech export pillar. If they fail, they are left with stranded assets and a thirsty population. The stakes are existential. So, is Uruguay the most stable nation in the South? Yes, but understand what that means. It is not utopia. It is not explosive growth. It is not flashy innovation at breakneck speed. It is a country that chose rules over revolution, contracts over charisma, predictability over passion. It is a conservative banking hub that legalized weed, a cattle ranch that exports software, a welfare state that is brutally expensive, a peaceful democracy with one of the highest civilian gun ownership rates in the region. It is a fortress built not with walls, but with consistency. In a world where populism rises quickly and collapses faster, where institutions weaken under social media pressure, where economic miracles are promised every election cycle, Uruguay just keeps doing something radical, paying its debts, honoring its contracts, debating its problems, spinning its wind turbines. It chose boring, and boring became a superpower. The question for 2050 is not whether Uruguay can survive chaos. It's whether it can survive its own cost structure. Can it remain stable without pricing out its own citizens? Can it remain innovative without abandoning the welfare foundation that defines it? Can it balance fortress economics with openness? Because fortresses protect, but they also isolate. And isolation, even the comfortable kind, eventually carries its own risk. For now, Uruguay stands as proof that consistency compounds. That institutional memory matters. That stability is not inherited, is engineered. And in an era obsessed with disruption. Uruguay reminds us that sometimes the smartest strategy is simply to stay boring.